Philosophy has a reputation for being abstract and difficult, which it certainly can be. It also has a reputation for being impractical, which it definitely is not. So today I want to give you one reason to believe that philosophy makes a life and death difference. To begin, let's consider the 20th century, which was a fairly warlike century. Here's the list of major wars of the 20th century. World War I began in 1914, ended in 1918. World War II, 1939 to 1945. What both of those have in common is most of the world's major powers going at it, tens of millions of people dead over extended years. The Cold War, usually dated from 1947 on to 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, sometimes dated from 1946 with Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953. Then the Vietnam War, which certainly looms large in the American consciousness from 1959 to 1975. Now, consider who was fighting in each of these major wars. Let's go back to World War I. On the Allied side, we do have Great Britain, we have France. Along with Great Britain, we have most of the Commonwealth countries participating, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And a little bit later into the war, the United States joins in. On the other side of the war, we have the so-called Central Powers, led primarily by Germany, and then also the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then further to the east, the Turkish or Ottoman Empire were involved. World War II, again, on one side, we have Great Britain, most of the Commonwealth nations, France, and of course the United States. On the other side of the divide, again, we have Germany. This time its allies are Italy and from the Far East, Japan. Right. Moving on to the Cold War, the one that lasted for most of the second part of the 20th century. The two primary belligerents, right, in this case are the United States against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Moving on to the Korean War, which began in 1950. This is primarily North Korea with behind-the-scenes support and sometimes explicit support from China and the Soviet Union. And on the other side, we have South Korea, this time explicitly allied with the United States. If we jump ahead to the Vietnam War, here we have again a North versus South battle. North Vietnam with support from China and again the Soviet Union. South Vietnam, again, with support from the United States of America. Now let's consider the countries on the left side of the list here, the ones that are consistently allies over the course of the 20th century, and ask what kind of political and economic systems do they embody? So here the countries primarily involved are the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, and so on. What all of them have in common is that they are broadly free market capitalist economic systems, and politically they are all democratic and republican. Now let's consider the nations on the other side of the divide, those on the right side of the chart that we're constructing here. Germany in 1914 was an authoritarian empire, as were the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. In World War II, by that time Germany had become a National Socialist regime. Its ally, Italy, was a fascist regime, and the Japanese political system at that time was a militaristic, authoritarian regime as well. If we move on to the Cold War, the primary belligerent in that case against the United States is the Soviet Union. This is a war that's cold, but it extends over the globe, and the Soviet Union is a communist regime, or an international socialist regime. If we move on to the Korean War, North Korea wanted to become communist, and it was getting support from the communist Chinese as well as support from the communist Soviet Union. And then moving on to the Vietnam War, which began in 1959 and accelerated on through the 1960s. North Vietnam wanted to become communist, and they were getting support from the communist Chinese and the communist Soviet Union. All right, so what we have, to summarize, is consistently on one side of the divide is a network of countries more or less consistently committed to free market capitalism economically and democratic and republican forms of government politically. On the other side of the divide, again, what we have is a network of countries more or less consistently committed to authoritarian forms of government, national socialist forms of government, international socialist forms of government, otherwise known as communist or fascist forms of government. Now let us ask about the theory of free market capitalism and democracy and republicanism. Who are the big names intellectually behind advocacy and development of the theoretical principles involved in those kinds of political and economic systems? Obviously, many names can be mentioned, but three of the most prominent names to be mentioned in this connection certainly are John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. I mentioned all three of those. John Locke is famous for giving a strong natural rights argument for a broadly free market, democratic republican kind of political system. John Stuart Mill is more famous for giving a utilitarian argument for a liberal capitalist kind of society. Adam Smith, of course, is the great name involved in developing the first generation of free market economics with his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Now let us ask the same question on the other side. When we think about socialism, communism, and more authoritarian forms of government, what big-name intellectuals are most associated with developing those ideas in the modern world? Again, many names could be mentioned, but three of the most prominent ones that should be mentioned are George Hegel, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Hegel wrote in the early part of the 19th century, Marx writing in the middle part of the 19th century, and Friedrich Nietzsche writing toward the end of the 19th century. Now let's ask a follow-up question. What do John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill all have in common? Two things. All three of them are British, and all three of them are philosophers. All three of them are part of a broad movement of intellectuals that dominated British, and by extension, those nations that were influenced by British intellectual culture, British philosophy and cultural life from the end of the 17th century on through the end of the 19th century. And now let's ask the same on the other side. What do George Hegel, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche have in common? All three of them are German intellectuals, and all three of them, again, are philosophers. Karl Marx, of course, is well known for being an economist and a political philosopher, but his PhD degree was in philosophy, and he developed an entire philosophy to support his political and economic system. Friedrich Nietzsche's degree was in philology, classical philology, but he's most famous for his very philosophical works across a wide range of issues. So this is why philosophy matters. One way of reading 20th century history with all of its wars is to point out the importance of the background philosophical collisions that have been played out over the course of the previous centuries. On the one hand, we have a number of nations, right, that had broadly bought into and were applying the kind of philosophical system that had been developed by John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and any number of other intellectuals against a number of nations that had committed to a political system based on philosophical works that had been devised by 19th century German intellectuals such as Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. Over the course of the 1700s and the 1800s, a philosophical debate over a wide range of issues was engaged, and largely British philosophers and German philosophers went down very different paths. As British philosophy became institutionalized in a certain number of countries, broadly free market and democratic republican political institutions developed. As German philosophy was developed and institutionalized in different countries, more socialist, communist, and authoritarian types of systems came into place. Philosophy came to be politically translated, and those colliding political systems then clashed repeatedly over the course of the 20th century. John Maynard Keynes famously said, quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." Unquote. Too true, John Maynard Keynes. Practical men almost always are influenced by intellectuals, and especially economists. But let me tweak that quotation a little bit and to say that behind the economists and the political philosophers stand philosophers. Philosophy, abstract philosophy, always makes a long-range practical difference when it's applied.